So David Eagleman's mother described him as an unusual child. He wrote his first words at 2. At 12, he was explaining Einstein's theory of relativity to her. He also liked to ask for a list of 400 random objects, which he would then repeat back from memory in reverse order. At Rice University in Houston, he majored in electrical engineering, but then he took a sabbatical and joined the Israeli army as a volunteer. He spent a semester at Oxford studying political science and literature, and finally moved to Los Angeles to try and become a stand-up comedian. That didn't work out. So he then went back to school, became a neuroscientist, and today lives in Texas, where he runs the Baylor College of Medicine laboratory for something complicated that I think he may explain here today, but that's not why I got interested in him. He's known in North America as a popularizer of science, but in the UK he has a reputation as a literary figure, and that's what got me to check out this book. It's a slim volume, kind of feels more like a book of poetry, prose poetry, and is comprised of vignettes, or thought experiments about different possibilities of the afterlife. I found some of these so startling that I got after him. It took a couple of years to get him to come here to speak to us, but I am going to crave your indulgence. I'm going to read you a couple of passages from this book so you get a sense of just how unusual this is. It's not often that you're confronted with a fact that just snaps you awake. This is called Some. In the afterlife, you relive all your experiences, but this time with the events reshuffled into a new order. All the moments that share a quality are grouped together. You spend 2 months driving the street in front of your house, 7 months having sex. You sleep for 30 years without opening your eyes. For 5 months straight, you flip through magazines while sitting on a toilet. You take all your pain at once, all 27 intense hours of it. Bones break, cars crash, skin is cut, babies are born. Once you make it through, it's agony-free for the rest of your life, your afterlife. But that doesn't mean it's always pleasant. You spend 6 days clipping your nails, 15 months looking for lost items, 18 months waiting in line. 2 years of boredom, staring out at bus windows, sitting in an airplane terminal. 1 year reading books. Your eyes hurt and you itch because you can't take a shower until it's your time to take your marathon 200-day shower. 2 weeks wondering what happens when you die. 1 minute realizing your body is falling. 77 hours of confusion. 1 hour realizing you've forgotten someone's name. 3 weeks realizing you're wrong. 2 days lying. 6 weeks waiting for a green light. 7 hours vomiting. 14 minutes experiencing pure joy. Amazing. And one more piece, startling. You ready for this? There are 3 deaths. The first is when the body ceases to function. The second is when the body is consigned to the grave. The third is that moment sometime in the future when your name is spoken for the last time. David.
Thank you, Moses. Well, it's a terrific pleasure to be here, and thank you, Moses, for getting me out here. How many of you, by show of hands, have heard of the ultra-deep field experiment by the Hubble telescope? Okay, a few people. For those of you who haven't, strap in, because this is one of the most amazing things that I know of in science. Some years ago, the Hubble Space Telescope decided that NASA decided they were going to find a little point in space, a little black point where there was nothing, and they were going to point the finely honed lens of the Hubble Space Telescope at that little spot where there's nothing to see if maybe they could find a star there, something that's too faded, too weak to see normally. So what they did is every time the Hubble came around the Earth, they pointed it at this little spot about the size of your thumbnail at arm's length. They pointed it there for 20 minutes as it went around, and then they pulled this trick off 400 times. And the idea was, can we collect up any lonely photons trickling in from the distant reaches of the universe to see if there's something there? And at the end of doing this, they compiled all the photons and they put together the image. And what they found there was not a star. What they found in that little spot in space was 10,000 galaxies. Now, a galaxy is 100 billion stars. That means it's 1,000 trillion stars, each of which, just like our sun, any of which has the potential to have planets around it and any unimagined form of biology that we haven't even been able to conceive of yet. That's what they found in this little spot of space, and I think this is a good consciousness raiser for thinking about the size of the unknown around us. So I'm a scientist, and I've devoted my whole adult life to science because I figure if we want to understand what's going on around us, we might as well study the blueprints directly. And science, especially over the last 400 years, has been tremendously successful. We've figured out so much about the fabric of reality. We've gotten men to the moon. We've cured smallpox and polio, invented the internet. But I think what one really learns from a life in science is about the vastness of our ignorance. So when you walk to the end of the pier of science, what you learn is that you get to the end of the pier at some point, and beyond that, it's all uncharted waters. It's all the stuff that we don't know, all the vast mysteries that surround us. So why mass and energy are equivalent, or why there are 13 spatial dimensions, or how to build consciousness out of pieces and parts, or what dark matter and dark energy are. Essentially, we're confronted with giant mysteries, and what one really learns from a life of science is that what we know is so greatly outstripped by what we don't know. So given that, I've been surprised. I've been interested in following what's happened with these books by the neo-atheists over the last decade. So there have been a number of really terrific books that have come out on neo-atheism, and these are some of my favorite books, and they're very important. But what's been interesting to me is the public perception that has come out of these books. Because a lot of times people read this and they go away with the impression that scientists are unable to gamble beyond the available data, and that scientists are acting as though they've got it all figured out. So F equals ma equals mc squared. We sort of got it figured out. We can capture the universe in equations, and those things that we haven't figured out quite yet should be amenable to figuring out with these same sort of tools that we have. And my concern there is that risks throwing out the baby with the bathwater, where the baby is all of the awe and wonder that brings us into science in the first place. Because I don't feel like that's a very good description of science, to act like we've got it all figured out. Because in fact, the way science actually operates is we go into the lab every day and we create lots of hypotheses, lots of narratives about what might be going on, and we try to gather evidence to weigh in favor of some of these stories over others. And often, you can't gather evidence because some questions are beyond the toolbox of science, beyond the ken of science today, and that's fine. In those cases, we have multiple hypotheses on the table because our table is wide. And the sort of ambiguity that we deal with is part of the agreement that we have with Mother Nature. And so the scientific temperament is really one of creativity, of coming up with lots of stories, and a tolerance for holding all these stories and being okay with that. So, given that, I feel like where we are right now in science, we know too little to commit to a position of strict atheism. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, I think we know way too much to commit to a particular religious position. So there are 2,000 religions on this little globe. And everyone already knows what it's like to be an atheist, because all you need to do is look at someone else's religion and you think, Well, it's ridiculous that you'd believe in that. And of course, they're looking back at you and thinking the same thing. And the fact is that the holy books of the world's religions, these are very beautiful and they often crystallize hard-won wisdom. But these were written millennia ago, before people knew about the size of the cosmos, or DNA, or quantum mechanics, or bacterial infection, or computation, any of these things. They didn't even know about neighboring landscapes or cultures. And so whenever I sit next to somebody on an airplane, I always ask them if they've heard of the Hubble Ultra Deep Field experiment. And so far, nobody has. But everybody can tell me all about the particulars of the religious story they grew up with. And you don't have to be an anthropologist to realize that our brains absorb whatever our cultures pour into them. So if you're born in Springfield, Ohio, you're going to love Protestantism. And if you're born in Rome, you're going to love Catholicism. And if you're born in Tel Aviv, you're going to love Judaism. And in Mecca, you're going to love Islam, right? I mean, if there were a single truth, you would expect that might spread everywhere evenly. But that's not what happens. There's not a blossoming of Islam in Springfield, Ohio, and there's not a blossoming of Protestantism in Mecca. And that's not going to happen because we absorb whatever our cultures tell us, and we come to love those stories. The problem is that people reach a point where they will fight and die over these sorts of stories. Now, as Ralph Waldo Emerson said, the religious stories of one generation become the literary entertainment of the next generation. So you don't see people fighting over Isis and Osiris anymore, or the Greek and Roman panoplies of gods, not so much, right? And so I want to illustrate this by telling you about the Bakuba kingdom and what their creation story is. So the Bakuba have the following creation story. There was a giant named Mombo, and one day Mombo had a sharp pain in his belly, and he vomited up the earth and the moon and the sun and the stars. And he still had a pain in his belly, and he had a second ejection, and included in the second ejection was, and I quote, the leopard, the eagle, the anvil, the monkey fumu, woman, medicine, lightning, firmament, and man. Okay. Now, if you consider this an unlikely explanation for how we got here, just consider that if you were Bakuba, you would find equally bizarre the story of the naked couple and the talking reptile and the prohibited produce, right? And if you were Bakuba and living in Kansas, you would be trying to get this into your children's textbooks. Now, I'm not suggesting that the story of the Bakuba kingdom is wrong or the story of Adam and Eve is wrong simply because there are competing stories. I'm suggesting that it's wrong because the entire weight of the available scientific evidence weighs so strongly against it. Daniel and Thomas's talks notwithstanding, when we gather up all the evidence about the evolution of creatures and so on, it doesn't seem to match any of these stories. So for my money, that puts me somewhere in the middle. And what has surprised me is that when you walk into the bookstores, what you find is so much certainty. So you find the books by the neo-atheists and you find the books by the fundamentally religious. And they argue with each other. They polarize each other. They're spending all of their energies addressing each other's arguments. And what surprises me is I feel like this is too limited a discussion in modern times. So if you consider the space of all the possibilities, take the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, that's a single space in the possibilities. Take the Eastern religions, that's another space in the possibilities. Take the idea that when we die, we just shut off and that's the end of it. That's a point. Take the idea that we were planted here by space aliens. That's another point. And you can keep going. You can keep making up lots and lots of points in this space here, each of which is infinitesimally unlikely to be true, but together they add up to give you this space of possibilities. And that's the part about which I feel there's been too little discussion. It seems there needs to be another voice besides this God or no God. It seems like for a modern discussion, there needs to be something a lot more than that addresses the real size of the possibilities here. And so it turns out that some people use the term agnostic if they stand in the middle. I don't use the term agnostic because I typically find that that's used as a weak term. People often say they're agnostic to mean I don't know if I believe in the guy with the beard on the cloud or not. So my culture has taught me something, meh, I kind of believe it, I kind of don't. That's what people often mean by agnostic. So I use a different term. I call myself a possibilian. And the idea with possibilianism is it's an active exploration of new ideas. It's a creativity in coming up with stories and a tolerance in holding many stories at the same time. Now, possibilianism is now 3 years old. And it was born on the day that I was giving an interview about my book, Some, on National Public Radio in the US. And I was talking about my opinions of this, about atheism and religion, and I said I'm a possibilian. And so I left this, it was a live interview. I left the studio, I drove back to my office at Baylor College of Medicine, where I'm a neuroscientist, and I settled in for a day's work, and I opened my email, and I had hundreds of emails from all over the nation, from people saying, hey, I think I'm a possibilian too. So I thought that was pretty cool, so I Googled the word, and it turns out the word didn't exist. There were 0 hits on that word 3 years ago. So I did what anybody would do. I bought possibilian.com, and then I waited to see what happened. Well, what happened was incredible, because within a few hours, Facebook groups started popping up on possibilianism. Over the next months and years, the number of hits on it grew. Now, if you Google possibilian, there are 73,000 hits on it. And what happened is it started spreading all around the world. And every major media venue started writing about possibilianism. I got emailed articles from the India Sunday Times, from the Uganda Sunday Times, and so on. Everybody started covering it. And it took off. And one thing that I thought was interesting and funny was I noticed as I watched this around the net that people maybe had misheard exactly what I said, so they started calling it possibilitarian and other things, and they spelled it every way you can imagine. And I thought, you know what? That's perfect. Spell it any way you want to. That's right in the possibilian spirit. But the question is why? How could a movement like this catch on, given that we don't subscribe to anything in particular? And I think the answer is, at this point, after this far into this century, after all these arguments between the neo-atheists and the religious, maybe people were getting a little bit tired of people arguing their points with certainty who can't possibly be that certain about their points. There's just too much unknown. So people are getting a little bit tired of the debates between Sam Harris and the Discovery Institute, and maybe a third voice is what was really desired there. Because as Voltaire said, uncertainty is an uncomfortable position, but certainty is an absurd position. Now, I want to make 2 points about possibilianism. So sometimes I'll speak to people about possibilianism, and someone will come up to me after the talk, and they'll say, that's great. I'm so glad that you get me with possibilianism, and that you're on board with me about ESP and crystals and so on. Okay, that's not possibilianism. Possibilianism is anything goes at first, but then we use the tools of science to actually carve that possibility space. So it would be terrific if ESP existed. We'd all love that. But to the degree that we can gather evidence and try to test for this, there is no data that we can gather in favor of it. So this is the sense in which we can use science to carve out parts of that space and even to open up new folds in that possibility space and see new arenas. Now, where possibilianism really takes off is where we're beyond the toolbox of science and where we have to hold lots of things in mind at the same time. And the reason this is so important that we do this is because of all the information that we know we're missing. So I'm not even going to talk about the unknown unknowns like Rumsfeld likes to do. What I want to talk about is the known unknowns. There's so much that we know that we don't know. We are confronted by vast mysteries. So take as an example the issue of dark matter. Now, I'm not sure how many of you know what dark matter is, but what happens is astrophysicists look in the cosmos and they see the way that everything's moving around, galaxies and so on, in relation to one another. And it turns out that you use the equations of gravity to figure out how this moves around, but it turns out you need a fudge factor because there's something that we can't smell or touch or see or hear, but it's required to explain why everything's moving the way it is. And so that's what's called dark matter. It's a piece that you put in the equation to sort of say, well, we can't really identify it, but it must be there. Okay. 90% of the known universe is what we call dark matter. That's a lot to sweep under the rug. Now, this is what I study here. This is the human brain, and this is essentially an alien kind of computational material that we find in the brain. We've never found anything like it. It's the most complicated thing ever discovered in our universe. The connectivity of it is so dense that if you were just to take a cubic centimeter of brain tissue, there are more connections in there than there are stars in the Milky Way galaxy. And yet somehow we know that it's us, because if you were to damage your pinky, you'd be sad about it, but you wouldn't be any different. But if you damage an equivalently sized chunk of neural tissue, that can change you entirely. That can change your consciousness, your decision-making, your risk aversion, your ability to see colors or understand music, right? So we know that somehow this is us. But what we don't know is how to build private subjective experience out of lots of pieces and parts. So imagine that I were to give you 100 billion Tinker Toys, and I say, okay, go ahead, hook these up however you want. Make this a lever, this moves that, okay, here's another one, here's another one. At what point do you add one more Tinker Toy and you say, now it is experiencing the taste of feta cheese? Right? Not only do we not have a theory of how that works, we don't even know what such a theory would possibly look like. Because with our tools, if you say, okay, carry the two, do a triple integral over here, at what point does that equal private subjective experience? The redness of red, smells, tastes, pain. We don't even know how to make that sort of equivalence. And what all this calls for is real intellectual humility. Now, I gave a talk on possibilianism some months ago, and a guy came up to me afterwards, and he said, you know, Dr. Eagleman, you should be a politician because you're not willing to commit to anything. And he said, I think you should just cowboy up and commit to something. So I thought about that. It's a very interesting expression that we have in Texas, cowboying up. And the idea is committing firmly to a decision. And we all like people who commit firmly to decisions. So if you're trying to decide, should I take my cattle out in the rain? Should I marry this woman? Should I sell the ranch? We like people who cowboy up and make a firm decision. But my suggestion is there are some domains in which it's appropriate to cowboy up and others in which it's not. So would you ask this gentleman if he thought that there were extraterrestrial civilizations in that little point in space there? Would you care about his opinion versus, say, an astrobiologist? And if you wouldn't ask him, maybe that suggests that there are domains in which it's useful to act with certainty, and other domains in which it's important to have intellectual humility if you just don't have enough evidence one way or the other. So the next time somebody tells you to cowboy up, I suggest you tell them, no, you know what? I'd rather geek out. And geeking out is the act of generating lots of hypotheses and having a tolerance for holding these all on the table at the same time. And what you can always tell somebody, you can cite the gospel of science, the 3 words that are the most important words that science ever taught humankind. I don't know. So, my suggestion to all of us as we are enjoying Idea City and getting our heads completely full of ideas is to develop this capacity to create lots of stories and be comfortable holding them in mind. And this is not just a plea for simple open-mindedness. It's a plea for an active exploration of new ideas, because I think this is important for the future of our education, of our legislation, maybe even our warfare. So when we leave this conference at the end of the week and we go back out into this strange world, let's see if we can figure out how to live a life that is free of dogma and one that praises possibility and celebrates uncertainty. Thank you very much.